South Korea's exports expand 1.3% on year in August. On Press Perspective today, we touch upon the latest regarding the South Korean economy. Welcome to Wednesday's edition of Press Perspective. It's September 3rd here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Now, economy has been at the center of the Lee Jae Myung administration's national agenda thus far this week. For more on this, I have Lee Ji-hoon with Reuters here in the studio. Ji-hoon, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Professor Yang Hee-dong at Ewha Womans University live on the line. Professor Yang, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for inviting me again.
Right, Ji-hoon, we will start here in the studio. Let's begin with your coverage for Reuters about South Korea's exports for the month of August.
Sure, yeah. Data showed this week exports in August rose for the third straight month, but the growth rate slowed to the weakest in 3 months to 1.3% from 5.8% in July. It was slower than market expectations of 3.0% expected in our survey. By product, semiconductors rose 27% as demand remains strong for AI technologies. Car exports also rose 8.6% thanks to strong demand for electric vehicles in Europe. However, by destination, there were signs the impact of U.S. tariffs was weighing on South Korea's exports. Shipments to the U.S. fell 12%, which was the biggest drop since May 2020, when global supply chains were disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The decline was led by cars and steel products, which are subject to high tariffs of 25% and 50% under Trump's tariff policy. Steel exports rose in semiconductors and wireless communication devices because they are currently exempt from Trump's tariffs. Economists said the decline in U.S. exports was even sharper last month due to the effect of front-loading before Trump's higher tariffs kicked in early August. And economists say U.S. exports will likely continue to fall throughout this year because of the impact of U.S. tariffs. But the pace of decline might be softer going forward because the 15% tariff on South Korea the U.S. has imposed is on par with those on Japan and the European Union, which are rival exporters.
Right. In the time being, though, Professor Yang, with regard to last month's exports, Bloomberg says South Korea's exports stayed solid, while the Wall Street Journal says exports slowed. How do you assess South Korea's exports for the month of August?
Well, it's really up to where you focus on. The Bloomberg emphasized on the growth rate of the sectoral export. For example, the semiconductors, as report already mentioned, semiconductors increased by 27% due to strong AI demand, and automobiles increased by 9%, particularly with a focus on the many different areas. So the Bloomberg, has the titles of very solid growth, whereas Wall Street Journal has a focus on some deteriorate export growth rate in August compared to July. So in July, we had about 5.8% the annual growth. Whereas the annual growth in August, they slumped down to 1.3%. So it's really up to where the focus is located now. And in person, I should say that our export performance will be pretty much mixed up to the different regions because Korea has experienced a very weak Korean currency. So the exchange rate is increased pretty high, over 1,400 won compared to per dollar. But we have suffered a lot from the reciprocal tariff. So we have to conduct some kind of sensitivity analysis between the increased tariff amount versus the weakened Korean currency. In the U.S. market, unfortunately, this tariff increase has overrode, right, the very positive phenomena of the weak Korean currency. But in the other regions, I mean, Korean export companies can enjoy a lot from the weakened Korean currency. So the impact of all these, global geographical and geological, trade issues, they really depend on about the international trade policies pertaining to the United States reciprocal tariff and etc. So I should say that the impact on the current export really it depends on different regions, particularly their trade policy.
Right. Staying with that, Professor Yang, as Chi-hoon mentioned earlier, findings for August show that South Korean exports to the US and China slumped while its exports to Southeast Asia soared. Could export markets and product diversification help to offset the impact of US tariffs, do you think?
Absolutely. The Minister of International Trade and the Raw Materials, Kim Jong-un, mentioned that we need to take care of three aspects to deal with this high recycled tariff. The first one is we need to encourage our companies to increase their domestic sales to dilute the bad impact from recycled tariff. And second one is our company need to diversify their export market. And the third one is our company needs to strengthen their core competency. So absolutely, the market diversification is included as one of the three major countermeasures, counter strategies of our export companies in dealing with the strong recycled tariff from the United States. So there's no doubt for that. The number one export market is China. Number two is the United States. Now, the Southeastern market, South Asian countries have emerged as the third export market for our companies. So we need to push up the export to those emerging markets in South Asia, and also we need to explore new markets in Middle East and Africa, etc. So at this right time to diversify our export strategies and increase our direct investment in those less developed countries, whereas we have to develop a very different strategies in dealing with the market for the United States.
Right, and speaking about the United States, Ji-hoon, do tell us a bit about the concerns raised by the central bank here with regard to the impact of 15% U.S. tariffs on South Korean products.
Yeah, last week the Bank of Korea held interest rates steady for the second consecutive meeting due to worries about household debt, but it also signaled that there will be imminent interest rate cuts, with 5 of 6 board members saying they are open to lowering interest rates in the next 3 months. At the meeting, the Bank of Korea slightly raised its economic growth forecast for this year to 0.9% from 0.8%, reflecting the government's stimulus measures. But that is still the lowest since 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit the global economy. And the central bank also said there will be a significant economic shock from US tariffs even after the trade deal. The tariff deal between South Korea and the United States avoided a higher 25% tariffs threatened by President Trump, but that is still higher than the 15% tariff is still higher than the 10% baseline tariff that had been in place, and almost zero tariffs South Korea had enjoyed under a free trade agreement. Considering the free trade agreement, the Bank of Korea said U.S. tariffs on South Korea rose more than other exporting rivals such as Japan and the European Union. And to be specific, South Korea was granted a tariff cut that is the 9th largest among 50 major exporting countries, compared with Trump's tariff announcement in early April. Still, compared with before Trump's tariff policy, South Korea faces tariff hike that is higher than more than half of the 50 countries. And because South Korea is one of the top exporters of steel products to the United States, which is subject to 50% tariffs, the Bank of Korea says Trump's tariff policy is having a larger impact on South Korea than other exporting countries.
Right. Ji-hoon, as part of efforts, therefore, to bolster growth, the Lee Jae Myung administration has shared a budget proposal that surpasses 700 trillion won for the first time. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular proposal and its objectives?
Yeah, last week, as the Bank of Korea held a policy meeting, the government of President Lee Jae Myung also announced its first budget plan for the administration. President Lee has pledged expansionary fiscal policy since his election campaign. And next year, the government plans to raise its budget spending by 8.1%. That will be the biggest increase since 2022, after 3 years of the former conservative administration, which prioritized fiscal sustainability. The policy focus will be on AI investment, which the government sees as a key area of focus to boost economic growth in the long term amid falling potential growth rates. The government said it will raise spending on research by 19%, which is the biggest on record, with a focus on AI to make South Korea a top 3 AI power, along with the United States and China. In other areas, spending on social welfare will be raised by 8%, with more projects to boost falling birth rates, which is already lowest in the world. Spending on industrial policies will be raised by 15% to support tariff-free exporters, and spending on cultural policies will also be raised by 9% because President Lee has prioritized his policy to make South Korea a global cultural power. There also has been pressure from the Trump administration to raise defense spending, and as a result, they will be raised by 8% to make it equivalent to 2.4% of GDP.
Right. Professor Yang, speaking as a scholar, what can you tell us about the risks and rewards of an expansionary fiscal policy?
Well, the expansionary fiscal policy means governments want to spend more, right, to cover up all of their promised expenditures. So the positive aspect of this very proactive posture is now the government take a very strong initiative to promote and invest for the future-oriented, the industry, such as AI, semiconductors, biotech, or whatever. But these days, lots of, very pessimistic and concerned opinions about this policy. The first one is inflation. The United States has suffered a lot from this kind of very proactive fiscal policies during COVID-19, and that is one of the major reasons why, the Biden has lost his had to step down and, being defeated by Donald Trump. And number one is the risk is crowding out of private investment. So somehow, the very proactive public investment may kick out the investment from the private sectors. Why does it matter? Because public investment all the time taking a very short perspective, short timeline, and all of a sudden they lose control of the qualities of the poor project management. So those are very significant, and the risks of public investment. And in Korea, we already have suffered a lot from over $700 billion of investment in AI data gathering. So the Korean government has spent a lot of money and a lot of years to collect a lot of data to support AI, as infrastructures for this industry, but more than half of the projects end up with a failure. All those data sets are not being used at all. So that is a good example of a very poor management of public investment. And also, if the government increase their budget, somehow they cannot stand against very strong demand from private and the citizen sectors. So they may have to divert their expenses toward like welfare sectors, the pensions and employment benefits, etc. So already government have spent a lot of money on this sectors, and this government, has taken up very private and the citizen, the side, And that is another concern for the very proactive the fiscal policies. So there is no single solution whether the proactive fiscal policy is good or not, but it's really up to the context, orientation of the current the government.
Right. In the meantime, though, Ji-hoon, some have flagged the growing debt to GDP ratio amid the expansion in spending. Could you tell us a bit more about the numbers there?
Under the expansionary fiscal policy stance, South Korea's fiscal deficit is projected to widen to 4% of GDP next year, which is sharply up from 2.8% projected for this year. Debt to GDP ratio will surpass 50% next year to an estimated 51.6%, compared with 48.1% this year. After the sharp increase next year, the government said it will slow expenditure growth to keep it at an annual average of 5.5% for the next 5 months. And under that pace, the debt to GDP ratio is expected to rise to 58% by 2029, which is 10 percentage point higher than where it stands now.
Right. Professor Yang, simply speaking then, what is the debt to GDP ratio? And should we be concerned about the rise in South Korea's debt to GDP ratio?
Yeah, well, the debt to GDP ratio means the ratio of countries' accumulation of government debt to its GDP. So a low debt to GDP ratio means an economy produces goods and services sufficient to pay back debts without incurring further debt. Well, as the reporter mentioned, this ratio has increased very sharply and the highest in our country's history. Now, debt to GDP ratio amounts to about 51.6%, which is the highest in our history. And fiscal deficit, which is a difference between fiscal revenue and fiscal expenses, amount to 4.2% of GDP. I mean, this ratio is far above the threshold. The government announced the threshold of 3%. And why is it bad? Because it only impacts on the long-term fiscal sustainability. If the government suffers this very, the high debt to GDP ratio, then government credibility will be deteriorated. That means if the government want to sell their country bond, they may have to promise to pay higher interests, meaning the more burdens for the pay to the owners of the government, the bonds with the higher expenses. So absolutely, every country is really concerned about the levels of debt to GDP ratio. Well, as we mentioned, the Bloomberg and many other journalists have very pessimistic opinions about the future, right, in terms of debt to GDP ratio. So Bloomberg mentioned that our debt to GDP ratio amount to 70% in 5 years, and it will reach about 100% by 2045. Well, because the population is decreased, and we spend a lot of money for welfare. So all these issues, meaning we will have far less fiscal revenues with more expenses from the government pocket. So even in this year, in April, the Fitch rating mentioned the Korea's public finance are no longer a credit strength. So that means we need to reflect all these changes in our demographics and welfare expenses into our tax and government revenue, the reforms. So we have to make some changes in the government income and expenses structures.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Ji-hoon, we have some time left, so let's quickly touch upon South Korea's consumer prices, which I understand dropped to a 9-month low last month. Could you tell us a bit more about this finding and its implications?
Yeah, consumer inflation slowed to 1.7% in August from 2.1% in July, which was the lowest in 9 months. It was much weaker than a 2.0% forecast in our survey, but it was not really a surprise for market participants because it was mainly due to a temporary factor of a drop in telecommunication prices. Last month, SK Telecom, which is the biggest with 24 million customers, provide a 50% discount in monthly fees to all of its customers to apologize for its data leak earlier this year. As a result, core inflation, which excludes volatile food and energy prices, slowed to 1.3%, which was the lowest in nearly 4 years. However, economists say it is unlikely to have a meaningful implication for monetary policy because the Bank of Korea said after the data was released that inflation is expected to rebound to 2% in September and remain there for some time being, which is around the Bank of Korea's midterm policy target of 2%.
Well, that would be 2% for them throughout the year.
Yeah.
I see. All right, well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have then. Ji-hoon, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you very much.
Professor Yang, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. We return same time tomorrow, so do join us then, and thank you for now.